So now I'm going to start by introducing our speaker today. Well, first of all, let me just say our topic, is human rights, and also what a credible human rights system would look like. That's what we're really delving into today. And it's very appropriate that we have this topic. It just happened that it fell this month because Dina wasn't available last month. But I think that's very appropriate because in just 3 weeks, the 70th anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, that anniversary is coming up on December 10th. So what a perfect time for us to really delve into human rights. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Dina Freeman as our speaker today. Dina is Deputy Director of One World Movement for Global Democracy, which is based in Tel Aviv. She's calling in from Tel Aviv. Thank you so much with the time difference. One World is an associated organization of the World Federalist Movement. Dina is an anthropologist, an Africanist, and a specialist in international development. She received her PhD from the London School of Economics and Political Science. With close to 20 years of experience in academia, Dina has taught at a number of first-class universities, too many for me to list right now. I first met Dina in 2017, I think it was March, in The Hague at the World Federalist Movement Council meeting. And I was impressed with Dina and the work that she's doing, so I suggested that she reach out to Joe Schwartzberg through email, and so they formed a connection. And that connection then led to the Workable World Trust partially funding her research trips to the Human Rights Council in Geneva late 2017. As she was delving into studying the process of making international law regarding transnational corporations and human rights. And then just to fill you in on something you'll all be quite interested in following, another project the Workable World Trust is funding is working with One World and with Oded in particular, but also Dina and an advisory council to create an online teaching resource on global democracy and justice. And the proposal that they submitted begins by saying, in order to build the movement, it is imperative to educate people about the current broken system of global governance and the need for world federalism and global democracy. So their online content will include high quality short video lectures about key topics, interviews with experts, academics, and key members of the World Federalist Movement, short films and animations, readings, online quizzes, and a step-by-step guide for course facilitators. And all of the films will be subtitled in English, so it will be very easy to translate those subtitles into any language and make that accessible worldwide. And as I mentioned, Oded will conduct the bulk of the work on this project, supported by Dina and an advisory council. Bob Flax is one of the members of that council. A lot of other people that you're well aware of. So with that introduction, I would like to turn over today's session to Dina. Thank you. And
okay.
There you go.
Am I unmuted? Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Nancy, for that lovely introduction. And hi, everyone. It's really exciting to be here with all of you, all across the United States, and I'm here in Israel. So lovely to meet you all this time. And very honored to be doing what I think is the first book club session since Joe has left us. So I feel very honored and somewhat heavy and sad and all at the same time to be doing this now, but just wanted to say that. But I would jump in straight away really with the theme of today's session, which is a credible human rights system. And the UN human rights system, how does it work? I'm actually just looking at how I share my screen. Let's try that again.
There's a bar, there you go.
How does it work, folks? Do you see my PowerPoint?
It's perfect. We're seeing the slide, and we're seeing then a box with your photo on to the right of that.
Okay,
perfect.
Now I'm just trying to see if I can actually, yeah. Oded, you need to turn something off. Okay, so the overview, what I want to sort of talk about in the next 20 or 30 minutes is really to give a very brief kind of history of the UN human rights system and the idea of human rights. and then to look a little bit of actually how does the current human rights system work, or how is it set up, what's it supposed to do. Then have a bit of a discussion with the problems of the current system, and then come to Joe's proposals for change. And probably at that point, and Nancy, you can let me know, but maybe at that point we'll stop and have a discussion. Or if you like, I got just a few minutes to let you know about some of my own research that Nancy mentioned at the Human Rights Council. So it's on a bit of different kind of topic, but it might be interesting.
Yeah, my inclination would be for you to continue explaining your own work, because in these sessions, we don't only focus on Joe's proposals or make the assumption that those are the only good proposals out there. So it would be fine for you to include your own, and that can be part of the overall discussion. Thank you.
Okay, super. So, I mean, to start with, obviously, the sort of brief history of where does the UN human rights system come from and why? And so obviously this is from after the Second World War and the atrocities that were committed during the Second World War. And out of that situation, the UN itself was built. And one of the first bits of the UN that was built was the Human Rights Council, or what was then the Commission on Human Rights, which was established in 1946 as a subsidiary body to ECOSOC. So it was very early, one of the key parts of the UN. And this was because after the war, there was a feeling that there needed to be peaceful relations between states, but also, and as well as that, there needed to be a situation where citizens would be protected against abuses by their own governments, by their own states. Right? So it was addressing a sort of a quite different bit of how we keep peace in the international system, particularly protecting citizens essentially against their own governments. So in 1947, the new Commission on Human Rights established a drafting committee to get to work on drafting what was to become the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, which was eventually published and signed in 1948. And the key aim, obviously, of this document is to achieve that second element of peace. It's not talking about peaceful relations between states, but it's talking about protecting citizens from their own governments. Now, I'm sure you've all seen the the Declaration of Human Rights. I won't go into all the detail, but what's important is that it's an aspirational document. It's not a legal document, right? It sets out ideas and aspirations, but it's not a treaty, and it doesn't bind anything, and it has no legal value. But we'll come back to that in a moment. But let's just look at what are human rights. Okay, this has become part of our language that we talk about it often without thinking about it. But what do we mean by human rights? So the human rights are a notion of rights that all human beings have, regardless of nationality, race, religion, gender, language, geography, color, or any other distinguishing feature. So everyone in the whole world, whoever they are, wherever they are, whatever their situation is, has these rights. Okay, and these rights are universal. And they're also inalienable, meaning you can't lose them. You can't do something and then you've lost those rights. Now, this might sound well and obvious to many of us, particularly if we live in the West, and particularly if we live in the United States, or in the sort of northern world. But actually, there's fundamental challenges within this whole notion of human rights, because they posit this universal, singular human identity in a world that is actually fragmented both politically and culturally. Right? We live in different states with different political systems, which basically enable our rights or lack of them. We also live in different cultures all around the world that have quite different ideas of what is good, what is bad, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And so on top of that very, very fragmented world, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights came along and tried to make something very universal. And I think that tension sits within the whole of the human rights system in many respects and has yet to be resolved. The other sort of fundamental challenge with the whole human rights system is that in most rights are essentially enforced by states, right? So the rights that most people have is because their state, their government enables those rights. But the Universal Declaration of Human Rights kind of implies, but doesn't have, the notion that there should basically be a universal global state that should uphold those universal rights. Like that would be the logical thing that would go along with a universal declaration of human rights. But in fact, it's not what we have, as you all well know. And this was built into the design of the UN and of the UN human rights system right from the beginning, right? That we have a notion of universal rights, but that somehow exist alongside an international system made up of separate sovereign states who make their own laws and essentially decide what rights to give their citizens and not. So, and this paradox very much sits right in the middle of the human rights system. So just to bear this in mind as we carry on with our discussion. Those issues notwithstanding, we can look at and think, step back and think, okay, what is the aim of the United Nations human rights system? Why does it exist? What's the purpose? And it basically has two purposes. The first is to create international law to protect human rights. So moving on from the aspirational document of the Universal Declaration, one of the aims is to actually create treaties which will make international law that will protect human rights. And then the second aim is to monitor the enforcement of these treaties. So having made this law to actually make sure that it's working in practice. Okay. And so there's been a system since 1946 when the Commission for Human Rights came into being, and 9 treaties have been made. The first one was made in 1965. I think I've got a list. Here we go. These are the 9 core human rights treaties. Should be on the screen now. The first one was made in 1965, and that's the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. The next 2 were very important, made next year in 1966. That's the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And together, these 2 are known as a sort of International Bill of Rights. And I'll come back and say something about that in a moment. And as you can see, every few years, there's been an addition, a new treaty, and the most recent being in 2006, where we have the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and also the Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. So this is an evolving and alive system, right? These are the 9 core treaties, but in a couple of years' time, there might be a 10th, and then an 11th, and so on. So this was very much the first aim of the system to make international law to protect human rights. So we can see that. Now, there are different kinds of, if we look at this list of even just the names of these treaties, we already get a sense that there's kind of different kinds of human rights, different understandings of what it means for there to be human rights, and sort of different types altogether. And the literature talks of 3 generations of human rights. The first generation are civil and political rights, such as the right to free speech, the right to a fair trial, the right to vote, freedom of religion, the right not to be tortured, right? And these are things that often we in the West think of as sort of fundamental human rights. When we talk about human rights, we often tend to think of these kinds of human rights. But actually, these are only one kind of the human rights. And many of these are written about in the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, 1966. Now, the second generation of human rights are economic, social, and cultural rights. These are written in the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, also 1966. These talk about quite different sorts of rights. So these could be the right to housing, the right to work, the right to education, the right not to live in poverty, the right to development, many types of rights in here. And you can see these are quite different things, like whereas these are sort of more positive as opposed to negative rights. And these are rights that actually say something about the nature of the social order, right? The right to work or the right to education implies that there has a government or whoever's organizing the social order has set up a system whereby everyone has access to work or education is available to everybody and in an accessible way. And these types of human rights are often less at the forefront of thinkers in the northern countries, particularly in the United States. And I would say the United States is one of the very few countries that actually has not ratified the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Okay. But this difference in rights, it stems back from the difference of basically the approach to human rights of those in the West, if you like, and those in the East and the South. So the Soviet Union and many of the, at the time, colonized and then soon afterwards colonized worlds, Africa, Asia, Latin America, they actually thought those kind of rights were much more important than the civil and political rights, whereas the North Americans and the Europeans tended to focus on these. And this is an ongoing issue. This is not just a historical thing. I will tell you about some of the discussions that I've overheard in the Human Rights Council to say this is a live and kicking issue. But the third generation of rights, which also fits into these discussions, are collective or group rights. Because all of those rights that I've spoken about up till now are individual rights, rights that individuals have. And yet in more recent years, there has been growing recognition that there should be rights attributed to groups of people. And these could be the rights of indigenous people or the rights of minorities, but it also could include concepts such as the right to a healthy environment, which is for a collection of people, rights to self-determination. So we see that what human rights are and the legal system that conveys human rights is emerging over time and is not universally agreed. Right? There are different ideas that are here, and this is relevant for all of our discussion. But now let's go back to the notion of, we've talked about these core treaties, and there are other treaties as well, but these are the 9 core human rights treaties. So how do these treaties work, right? Once we've made international law that is protecting these various different kinds of human rights, how do they work? So here's the theory. Once the text of a treaty is agreed, and that generally will have been negotiated on from anywhere between 2 years and 10 years, incredibly long and slow process in the Human Rights Commission or Council, then states are invited to sign and then to ratify. And a state is only legally bound by a treaty if they ratify it. Okay, so this whole system, as with everything else at the United Nations, is somewhat voluntary. A state does not, they could have been part of all the negotiations over many, many years and then not ratify, right? In which case it is not legally binding on that country. And to have an idea of whether states do ratify or not, you can see that these different treaties are ratified by very different numbers of states. I think you can see on the screen now, if you see on the top left, ICCPR, that's the civil and political rights. That's the things about no torture, freedom of speech, and so on. So
Gina, I just want to interrupt for 1 second. I know those on the phone cannot see the slides. We will be sending out the slides so you can follow along. I think, Gina, you're explaining things so clearly that people probably can follow just fine. But for those on the phone feeling like you're missing out, we will send the slides later on. Go ahead, thank you.
Okay, I'll try and explain what we're seeing then just as well, so that everybody's involved. But just to see, we've got 4 pictures here, and the top left shows all the countries of the world and who has ratified the Convention on Political and Civil Rights. And you see that most of the world is looking dark green, meaning they have ratified it. There's just a few who are in light green, which mean they've signed it but not ratified it. And a very few number who have not signed or ratified. I think we see Saudi Arabia there. I'm not sure if that's South Sudan or Central African Republic, somewhere in Africa. A few countries, very, very small number of countries. And if we go on to the top right one, this is the International Convention on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. So it's the second of the major treaties. And again, you see most of the countries are in dark green. They've signed it and ratified it. America is very obviously one of the very, very few in the world not to have done so, which is possibly interesting for some people. And also Saudi Arabia and a few others in Africa haven't signed that either. But the majority have. But if we look at the two maps on the bottom of the screen, we see a very, very different picture. So on the bottom left, we have the rights of migrant workers. I mean, there's a long title, I don't remember, but essentially this was the Covenant on the Rights of Migrant Workers. And here we see very, very few countries have ratified this. We see that it's basically a few in kind of West Africa and in Latin America and Central America. And essentially it's the countries that tend to send a lot of migrant workers, but all the countries that tend to receive migrant workers, right? North America, I mean, America, Canada, most of Europe, India, and many, many others, Australia, have not signed it. Okay, so it's a very small number of countries have signed this one. And on the bottom right, we see about the Convention Against Enforced Disappearance. And here, again, it's a sort of very mixed bag. Many in Latin America have signed and ratified, some in Europe, a few in Africa, but large areas where we see that no countries have not signed. So the first thing just to note here is that even though we have these 9 core treaties, that some of them are widely ratified and therefore in force, and many of them are very only partially ratified. So this is why I said this is not a system really of world law, of global law. It's a kind of patchwork network of national laws, and it's very patchwork, and there are very many holes in it. So even if a country does ratify, what's the next step? So in most cases, what they need to do is then create a corresponding national legislation in order to ensure the implementation of the provision within their national jurisdiction. Okay, so once it's like the international law is the standard, and then you make your national law that fits with that international standard. So we see this is the sort of idea of how the treaty should work. So that if a state has ratified the treaty, it makes its own law and puts in its own national law provisions to ensure that that treaty is followed and those rights are protected. So then the question comes up of, well, so how are these treaties enforced, right? If a state has done all of these things, has ratified and has said, right now I'm legally bound by this treaty, I'm going to enforce these rights, what happens if they don't? Or how does anyone know what they do? So the major answer and the key problem is these treaties are not enforced. There is no enforcement system. But what there is a monitoring system. And this is really the main role of what used to be the Commission for Human Rights and now is called the Human Rights Council. So there are 2 different types of systems by which these treaties are monitored. There's the treaty mechanisms and the charter mechanisms. And I will talk about both. Let me just, next slide is okay. So the treaty mechanisms are such that each of those treaties, the 9 core treaties that I talked about, will have a treaty body. And a treaty body is UN speak for a committee of experts who monitor the implementation of that treaty. Okay, so these are not state representatives, they're experts, which is important. Now, the way that the treaty body for any treaty is set up will be a little bit different. And often in the treaty, there will be an optional protocol at the end of the treaty, which has the details of how you set up the treaty body. And if you look through all those 9 core treaties, you'll see they're all set up rather differently. In all of them, the states basically provide a periodic report every few years on the human rights situation in their country regarding to that treaty. So they come along to the treaty body and say, with regarding civil and political rights, this happened, this happened, this happened. We're really good on this, we're really good on that, we're really good on the other. That's generally what tends to happen. And the experts in that treaty body will listen. They will also have got other information from NGOs, from other sources, and they might question and say, oh, really? Is it really like that? And there'll be this sort of discussion. In some of the treaty bodies, they have a bit more power. So some of them, for example, they can actually organize visits to that state and fact-finding missions to go a bit deeper. In some of them, they can conduct special inquiries. For some of them, individuals can actually bring a complaint to the treaty body if they feel their rights have been violated. And in some of them, states can actually make complaints against other states. Now you see, these things give it a little bit more force, right? If an individual can actually come up and say, okay, well, the state is saying all these nice things, but I've actually had my rights violated in this way, and here's the evidence, that's got a little bit more power than those that only rely on what the states say. And so often the negotiations of these protocols, optional protocols at the end of the treaties, include all these details. And you'll see that there's a real variation, that some of the treaty bodies really don't have hardly any power at all, and some have a little bit of power, depending on these things. But even when they have a little bit of power, it's really, really small. At the end of it, there's no power to demand changes, and there's no power really to ensure enforcement. The treaty bodies will make recommendations, will say, you know, state, you know, we think you've done really well on A, B, and C, but you need to do more work on X, Y, and Z, and you really need to sort of stop torturing people, or you need to really do this and do that. But they can make these recommendations, and they can be completely ignored. And they often are. And that is really how the treaty bodies work to enforce or to monitor the treaties. Now, there are also charter-based mechanisms. And the main one here is that there's a reviewing and monitoring by the Commission on Human Rights. Just to say, the Commission on Human Rights existed from 1946 to 2006. At that point, it was disbanded, and a new Human Rights Council took its place. And I'll come to that in a moment. The original commission, when it was originally set up in 1946, it actually had 18 members, but over time that's expanded. And by the time it came to its end, it had 53 member states who were members, all elected according to region. And essentially, this would be the big meetings in the commission. They would also consider reports of countries against the human rights situations regarding to the rights in the treaties to which they had ratified. And in theory, there would be a discussion, and there, again, no enforcement mechanism other than a bit of finger pointing and people being told off. There wasn't really anything it could do. Now, why did the Commission on Human Rights get disbanded in 2006? It was because it was really, really, really ineffective, really desperately ineffective. And what was happening was that all the representatives on the Commission for Human Rights, of course, were representatives of their states. And so they weren't specialists in human rights. They didn't really necessarily care very much about human rights, but they were representing the will of their governments. And so what tended to happen in the sessions was that just states that wanted to kind of point fingers at each other or score political points against each other would accuse them of this, that, and the other, and they would ignore very, very severe human rights violations that were taking place by their allies or countries that they didn't want to get into a fight with. And so there was no real discussion of human rights. On top of that, many of the countries that were sitting on the Human Rights Council were major human rights violators themselves. You know, we had Saudi Arabia and Syria and many, many, many problematic countries were on the council. And that they would join the council as a way to avoid having the finger being pointed at them. So all of this just led to it being a very hyper-politicized discussion, and no one was really seriously interested in protecting human rights. So in 2006, this commission was disbanded and the Human Rights Council was put in its place, trying to solve some of those problems, and I would say not really succeeding. And this will actually lead us to some of Joe's proposals in a moment. But the Human Rights Council decided to have a slightly smaller membership. So instead of 53, it went down to 47. And these would be elected by the General Assembly rather than by ECOSOC, so a slightly kind of higher level there. And in many respects, it didn't really solve the problems, but in terms of our question right now about how are treaties monitored, they set up 3 new procedures or strengthen these procedures to try and improve how the treaties were monitored. So the first one was a complaints procedure. They set up a new complaints procedure whereby anyone who met the eligibility criteria could complain directly to the Human Rights Council about a specific major violation. And then the Human Rights Council would issue recommendations. Again, only recommendations, but it was a way of trying to sort of get issues directly discussed in the council. The second thing that they instituted that was quite interesting was the Universal Periodic Review. And this is a system whereby each country needs to submit reports every 4.5 years to the Human Rights Council. And then there'll be a 3.5-hour session where they are questions and answers, basically, by other NGOs, by other states, about the state of human rights in their country. Now, again, this has no binding, nothing can be done, right? It doesn't enforce anything, but it can be quite embarrassing, right? It can be quite embarrassing for countries to have their sort of human rights situation discussed in public and pulled apart in public. But really, that's all it can do. It can be embarrassing and shaming. And the third thing that was, I think, strengthened under the Human Rights Council was the system of what the UN calls special procedures. And in UN speak, special procedures are two types of things. They are either individuals who are known as rapporteurs, often special rapporteurs, or they are working groups. And each either rapporteur or working group can be country focused or thematic focused. So there might be a working group on Syria, or there might be a working group on the right to education, or there might be a special rapporteur who's off to investigate what's happening in the Philippines, or who's writing theoretical things about the right to development, or what it might be. So this sort of builds up a kind of a resource base and a sort of intellectual work and more information coming, but still all of these working groups and rapporteurs basically bring findings and recommendations, and they can be discussed by states and they can be ignored, and they often are ignored. So that's how the current system is working, right? We've made laws, international human rights laws in treaties. Some countries choose to ratify those treaties, some don't. Those that do are theoretically bound to honor those treaties in their countries, but there's no enforcement mechanism. Instead, there's these various different kinds of monitoring mechanisms through the different routes in the UN human rights system. So we see it's a very weak system, really, in many regards. Beyond its sort of fundamental weakness, there are problems in its workings. And, you know, I think from Joe's point of view, he didn't have too much criticism of the fundamental structure, the fundamental workings, the way this system that I've just described is set up. Joe thought that was essentially the right way to do things. But there was, even this system doesn't work the way it was supposed to work. And that's really where Joe focuses his reform proposals. And I think maybe we can discuss in the discussion whether we think that's enough. But even within this weak system, one of the main problems that's continued is the politicization. Okay? Is the fact that really, however much we set up treaty bodies and these different universal periodic review and these different review systems, really try to get the Human Rights Council to really talk about human rights and really talk about how we protect the human rights of individuals. What tends to happen is it just tends to be a very politicized discussion with countries, with representatives of their states, just saying what the party line of their government is, and that those different countries that have tensions between them, just using the language of human rights to basically point fingers at each other and you know, try and embarrass each other. You know, and one very obvious example of that, especially sitting where I'm sitting right now, is the persistent criticism of Israel for many, indeed, serious human rights obligations in the occupied territories, but at the same time ignoring other similar abuses elsewhere. The sort of ratio of criticism to Israel versus criticism of other occupying states and other states that do terrible things is above all kind of out of any proportion. But more than that, even if you look at what's being discussed, I mean, I was sitting in the Human Rights Council in the session in March, and, you know, I listened to Syria talk about all the wonderful human rights situation in its country, like with a straight face. And then when the reports that sort of says all these major abuses and violations going on, the response is, this is political, you're going against our sovereignty, get out of our business, like, you know, this is all politically motivated. And then all the countries that support Syria basically say the same thing. All the countries that are against Syria say, come on now, there's serious human rights violations. And there's no real discussion, right? The battle lines between various countries are kind of already set and are not really about human rights, they're about other issues. And that's what guides the discussions at the Human Rights Council. So linked to that also is the tendency to turn a blind eye to major human rights abuses, you know, and I think obviously, you know, nothing has been done about human rights abuses in Syria, for example, from the Human Rights Council is a good example, but there are many, many others. So it's very problematic. On a procedural level, this notion that countries are writing reports about their treaties and about their situations in their countries, it also doesn't really work very well. Because if a country had actually ratified most of these treaties, they, I think, have to produce a report. I think someone calculated that it's on average once every 6 months to this treaty body, then to that treaty body, then to the Universal Periodic Review, then to this one. And so it takes up a huge amount of time and resource to actually, of governments, especially of third world governments that have less time and resource, to do this. And so what happens is many countries are very late with reports. They either just don't do them, they're very late sending them in. And then on top of that, the cycle at the Human Rights Council itself is backlogged. So there's actually a backlog of something like 4 years worth of reports that have been submitted, but they haven't had time yet to be discussed at the Human Rights Council. So all of these things leads to everything being way out of date. By the time something is discussed, it's 4 or 5 years after it might have been relevant, if it ever gets discussed at all. So there's a lot of problems in the workings of this system. And finally, what I think, you know, is really the fundamental and most major problem is there are no penalties for non-compliance. The only power that the whole of the Human Rights Council and any of its parts has, you know, is just to say, oh dear, you should do better. It really is, there's no penalty. So other than it all being a bit embarrassing for certain states, it's not a system with much power. So that's my brief overview of how the system works and what the problems are. Now I will come to Joe's proposals for reform. And as I said, he's not really critiquing the whole notion of how we have international law and treaties and monitoring and so on. He's trying to find a way to just make that part work better. And we can group his proposals into sort of two groups, those that focus on structure and those that focus on procedure. So regarding structure, Joe suggests that the Human Rights Council should become a principal organ of the UN, on a par with the General Assembly and the Security Council. So the moment it kind of sits underneath as a subsidiary of the General Assembly. So he wants to put it up and say human rights are really, really important, and this should be like the third major arm of the UN. And I think this is a good idea. This would be a good thing. His next set of suggestions are really about how to make the membership the right membership, so that we have the right people on the council so that it will do its job better. And he has various different suggestions around this. First of all, he wants to reduce the membership to increase efficiency. So if we have this, he thinks there's too many there, so the discussion goes all over the place. So he wants to reduce the membership from 47 states down to 36. Now within that, he has a number of suggestions of who these 36 representatives or members should be. First of all, he wants to improve the geographic representation by because all the members at the moment are chosen by regions, as they are in most parts of the United Nations. And there are kind of 5 regions that are defined according to the UN system, and we have so many from each region. And Joe, in a different chapter of the book that maybe you discussed already in the previous week, has a suggestion of changing the 5 regions to 12 regions, so to have a more kind of nuanced intersection of what the regions would be. And then from this 12 regional system, he wants to have 2 members from each region. That would take us to 24 out of the 36 people that he's suggesting. So improving the regional geographic representation is the reason for that. He also wants to improve the gender balance. And I think this is very, very important because yes, when you go to the Human Rights Council, you do tend to see that it's an awful lot of men sitting around there, and that many, many, many human rights violations are actually done to women more than men. So having some more women in the council would be very important. So he suggests that of the 2 representatives that come from each region, 1 should be male and 1 should be female. So we'd have a 50% female, equal gender split at the Human Rights Council. Then he comes to what is probably one of his more controversial suggestions, a very interesting one. And this regards Indigenous people. And I think from Joe's point of view, he's rightly aware that many of the human rights violations in the world are also done to Indigenous peoples, Indigenous populations, who are often minorities living in the margins of other societies, and who often aren't represented, because basically we have representative of states, and the Indigenous peoples are only a minority within a state, so they don't have representation. So Joe suggests that there should be 2 members from Indigenous groups that will sit on the Human Rights Council. And again, 1 would be male and 1 would be female. Now, this is why this is so controversial, and I think this would be a good thing that we can maybe discuss in the discussion, is because this would be the opening up membership to non-state representatives, right? The whole of the UN system is based on representatives of states. If we had representative Indigenous groups, they are not states, right? So this is challenging a fundamental element of the UN system, and we can maybe discuss some of the implications of that. One thing that I think possibly we would need to think through is, if we did do that challenge and open up representation to other people that weren't states, would we stop at Indigenous people? Who else might we want to include, right? What about minorities in other states, right? The Kurds, you know, they're not really represented by a state. The Yazidis and many, many, many others. And we'd think, well, does this take us down a slippery slope to somewhere that's a bit of a mush? Or does this actually improve representation and break us out of a very rigid only state system? Joe doesn't really discuss the implications of that, but I think maybe if you've had personal discussions with him in the past, or if you have your own views, it would be an interesting one to talk about. But anyway, that would take us up to 26 people. And to get to his final 36, there's another 10 members that would be elected at large. So these would not exactly be tied to particular regions, but would be added in largely for their qualities and their knowledge of human rights and their expertise and their being of sound character and so on. And this is really to try and lift up the level of discussion in the Human Rights Council, so that we're really talking about human rights and not this politicized discussion that I've mentioned before. So if we have, if these 10 and to a certain extent all of the others are being selected on the basis of their knowledge and expertise in human rights, then we're going to have a more serious discussion. He's also aware that if representatives of countries are actually going to talk based on their expertise in human rights and not based on the politics of that country and the interests of that government, that's quite a difficult situation to organize. And so therefore he realizes that these representatives would need to be granted immunity to be able to speak freely, and quite possibly in certain situations sanctuary if they actually said something that was against what their state, what the line of their state was. And I think these are very complicated issues. Like, I think the desire behind these reforms to turn the discussion in the Human Rights Council to be a real discussion about human rights and not this politicized finger pointing that's happening is really important and really, really right. How this would work in practice and whether it's possible and what would be necessary to make it happen, I think, again, is other things that we can perhaps discuss in the discussion. Now, the final set of Joe's proposals around procedure. So if we change the structure, as he said, we still need to make some changes to procedure. And one of the key things that he suggests is that there needs to actually be more time for discussion and debate. And it's true, the regular sessions of the Human Rights Council take place over, I think, about a month or 5 or 6 weeks, 3 times a year. It's a very, very short time. So he said we need to expand the sessions so there's actually more time to talk, go into depth, do things properly. When it comes to the voting system, he actually suggests keeping it as it is, right? In contrast to his suggestions for changing voting systems in other parts of the UN, Joe wants to keep the voting system as it is, 1 member, 1 vote. And this is because if the other reforms that he's suggested on structure are implemented successfully, the discussion will have moved from being political to being really one on principle, on human rights principle, in which case 1 member, 1 vote will be sufficient. The whole reason for the weighted voting was to take into account the power politics in the outside world. And in the Human Rights Council, Joe thinks that making his other changes would kind of deflate that enough. It's also something that perhaps we can discuss. Then he suggests improved transparency and accountability. This is always a good thing. Strengthening and regularizing the participation of NGOs. This actually is very, very important because NGOs, human rights NGOs, play a very important role in much of the Human Rights Council. They're present, they can speak, they can't vote, but they often have an important role bringing issues to the fore. They're the ones that sort of say the things that the states don't want to say. So they play a very, very important role. And Joe would like to have that kind of strengthened and made more regular. And then also, of course, increasing funding for the Human Rights Council. And, you know, it's fundamental. The Human Rights Council has such a tiny, tiny budget that it's struggling to do anything. So if you actually really wanted to make this system strong and effective, increasing funding is going to be key. So that's a summary of Joe's proposals for reform, which I think would certainly improve the Human Rights Council. I think personally I would want to go further. Maybe I'm perhaps more of an idealist in a way than Joe's always taking the very much balance of workable world of what he thinks possible. And indeed his system, many of the things that he suggested are quite radical and quite difficult to push through on its own. I guess where I'm coming from, I think a whole system of treaties with no enforcement it's just too weak, and that really we need something much, much stronger, but it might be quite difficult for us to get there. But we can discuss all of that in the discussion. I'm just going to take 5 minutes, if I may. Is that okay, Nancy, just talk about my work?
Yes, that's fine, although I must point out it's 12:05, which, you know, we took a little while to get to introducing you and allowing you to share your presentation. Maybe try to make it 2 or 3 minutes, and so we do have some time for discussion.
Okay, 2 or 3 minutes, very, 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 very briefly. So I'm following, we talked about how there's new treaties and treaties evolve over time and there's new treaties. So I'm watching a process where people are trying to make a new treaty, right? And I don't know whether it's actually going to succeed and turn into a new treaty or not. And this new treaty would be about applying human rights law to business corporations, particularly to transnational corporations. So it's a whole new area of human rights, and it brings up many, many interesting issues. Because at the moment, human rights obligations are only for states, right? Because of the history of where human rights comes from. And it's the state's responsibility to ensure that other actors, such as corporations, don't violate people's rights. But with many cases with transnational corporations, there are situations where it's not clear which state would actually have jurisdiction over their activities. And I won't go into details, but there are many legal loopholes where a company that's registered in country A but operating in country B does something bad in country B, and then they don't know which court to take violations to. And essentially there's no court to take violations to. So because of this, and what a coalition of NGOs and human rights movements and social movements and groups of affected peoples who feel that their human rights have been violated by multinational corporations, often mining companies and so on, have really pushed to get this being discussed in the Human Rights Council. And it's being led by Ecuador and South Africa. They're the two countries that are sort of leading it because NGOs don't have a voice, right? So they do things in other ways. And so, you know, there are a lot of interesting questions. First of all, just how is the whole process of making human rights law, right? Will this new law that extends to transnational corporations, will it get made or will it not get made? Who's pushing for it? Who's against it? What are the power dynamics? Where is democracy in the decision-making of whether this becomes law or doesn't become law? What are the interests of the North and of the South, of business, of NGOs, right? So I'm diving into all of that and trying to watch those processes. Incidentally, most of the northern countries are very against this law. So the United States, Canada, many others don't even participate in the discussions. The European Union does, but is in a very negative way. So it also changes our picture of human rights, because often we think, oh, it's the northern countries that like human rights, and it's the southern countries that they're the baddies that don't do human rights. Whereas in this discussion, it's actually the southern countries who are saying we want this law, and it's the northern countries saying we don't. And I think this comes also back to some of these questions about human rights as being about the civil and political rights or about the economic and social rights. And this is sort of underlies much of the discussions. So there's also questions of what would be the implications if you extended human rights obligations to corporations rather than just states. How would that sort of change the whole human rights system? And some questions of, can the human rights system be used to actually regulate global capitalism, right? If we're trying to, if these social movements and so on are trying to sort of limit the impunity of large corporations that they feel are polluting their areas and evicting them from their lands and so on, they're using the human rights system as the potential legal system to try and regulate these companies in global capitalism when there isn't actually any other system. Anyway, so it's very interesting, and that's really what I'm diving into, and I think I'll leave it there. If anyone's got questions, feel free, but it's that's what I'm doing, and I'm very grateful for Workable World Trust for funding my first 2 visits to the Human Rights Council, which really enabled me to get going with this research.
Wow, thank you, Jean. That was wonderful. Can I ask you to turn off your screen sharing, or do I do that? I think you can do that, right?
Yep, there we go.
Yeah, and then we can get back to seeing everyone. I could unmute all, I guess, for our discussion. I will do that in a second. Let me just say, that was fascinating. I really appreciate learning all of those things, and you put Joe's proposals in a very clear perspective for me as well. I just want to mention that Citizens for Global Solutions Minnesota has been holding third Thursday Global Issues Forums for 18 years or something like that. We have this wealth of amazing talks that have been held in the past year, and a good number of them in the last few years have been recorded. And in January 2017, we actually had one that talked about human rights treaties, which ones have and haven't been ratified by the US, which is most of them have not. Why is that? Who's opposing it? And what actions can we take to move that forward? It was a very interesting talk. And it was recorded. So after this session, I will send out to all of you a link to that in case you'd like to watch that when you have some time, and also links to a lot of the treaties that Dina was referring to. That's a great follow-on from exactly what you were talking about. So with that, I'm going to unmute all. Let's, anything you'd like to share, any of you, in this discussion. And if you're expecting a lot of background noise, you can mute yourself.
Yeah,
Hi.
Nancy, I have a question. Yeah, it's fine. Hi, yeah, Dina, thank you so much for that presentation. It was really clear and very enjoyable. Two quick questions. Firstly, I also sort of take a legal perspective that international law, which is binding, should have enforcement. So I tend to agree with you in that respect. And so my question for you is, do you support, or did you support, for example, there was a proposal by the Swiss government, I think in 2011 or 2012, for a new international human rights court that was a very, very strong court, but it was supported by Mary Robinson and people like Theodore Marone, so very high profile personalities in the human rights universe. So what your thoughts are on that proposal, and do you still see support for the creation of an international human rights court in any circles? And secondly, about this new potential treaty on human rights and corporations, can you just say very, very briefly why the northern countries are criticizing this initiative? What is the rationale they're giving?
Okay, thanks, Maya. Those are interesting questions. And a little bit related. I might actually start with the second one first. So it's interesting that actually, as part of one of the many things being discussed in the idea of the Treaty on Transnational Corporations and Human Rights is actually an international court on business and human rights. So that has some relation to the previous court. But that is opposed by most people other than the social movements. I mean, I'll tell you why the excuse, and in my mind, it is the excuse that the northern countries use, is there's something called, well, actually, let me start back. There's a 40-year history of trying to make international law to regulate transnational corporations through the UN, right? This started in the 1970s and has not been successful all the way along. And there's always been a north-south divide to it. And it's largely based on the fact that, certainly in the 1970s, really all of transnational corporations were essentially northern corporations with headquarters either in Europe or America or a few other northern countries, who were then operating in southern countries. Okay, so it was kind of our corporations that were working overseas. And so therefore what our governments, our northern governments wanted is for these corporations basically to have as much freedom to do what they want as possible. Now, in the early discussions in the 1970s, the North were wanting, what they were scared of was that southern countries would appropriate the assets of these companies. So they were interested in discussions of international law because they wanted to set up a way to bind southern countries to essentially not appropriate their assets and things like that. The southern countries were interested in discussing international law because they wanted these foreign companies coming into their lands to sort of work under their laws and do things in a way that benefited them rather than just pollute all their environment and take all the assets and profits away. And so for a couple of decades, these discussions went on balancing the different interests of North and South. But then what happened is the North realized they could get what they want by setting up bilateral trade and investment treaties, which you probably have heard about. And they have various forms of investor-state dispute settlement. And basically they set up a form of hard binding international law, which guarantees the rights of investors and of multinational corporations operating in the South. And that's the bit of the negotiations that the North had wanted. And once they got that bit, they weren't interested in carrying on with the negotiations for what the South wanted. And so since then, those negotiations have fallen down. And what happened most recently was a set of voluntary guidelines called the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which says very nice things, but it's all voluntary. And this call for a treaty is coming out against that, saying, why do you have hard law that protects the rights of companies, but only voluntary law that protects the rights of humans, of citizens? And that's the current balance. Now in the world, there are transnational corporations, about a third of them are actually headquartered in the global south, in Brazil and India and China. So the nature of north-south is changed a little bit, but that's the fundamental challenge. Much of it is that the European countries, and I'm British as well, right? So speaking as a European, it's really embarrassing seeing the hypocrisy of the Europeans in the Human Rights Council, right? That they really want to present themselves as being very for human rights, but when you actually look at what they vote for and against, right? They vote against having human rights on corporations. There was a recent discussion on peasants' rights, recent declaration on peasants' rights. The European Union voted against that. So we have to dig a little bit deeper in understanding how the North used the language of human rights and the human rights system. And just for briefly into your first question about having human rights court, I mean, I personally think that would be a great idea. Whether I think it's possible, I think it actually is probably unlikely to be possible because the North don't want it. And it would be because what would be in the remit of this court. So yeah, I better stop now, otherwise no one else get a chance to have a question.
Thank you, Dina.
Other comments? Everyone's in awe, I think. Bob.
Yeah, I have a question. First, thank you for an excellent presentation. Very well organized, very clear. So my question is, some years ago, I took a course on international law, and one of the first topics that they addressed is the question, is international law really law? And we looked at both sides of it, and students even debated and all that stuff. And as a World Federalist, I had a position coming in, but the opposing position, that international law is really law, they made a statement that I put forth a concept that I never heard of before. And they said there are two kinds of law. There's vertical law and horizontal law. And vertical law is what we're used to in a country where the enforcement mechanisms kind of come down on a situation. But in horizontal law, the other countries help enforce it horizontally through anything from embargoes to military force and all that. And they were arguing there are actually a number of mechanisms to enforce these treaties, which I came in again thinking are bogus, So my question is, within the area of human rights, have any of these treaties, has anyone actually enforced any of them? Have folks come in this quote horizontal way, whether again through embargoes or other kinds, not withholding aid or whatever it is, to actually enforce anything having to do with human rights, or zero, nothing like that has ever happened. So if you know about that or can speak to that, thank you.
Okay, good question. I mean, I think some of that happens in some cases in a small way. So like, I think we can't say this entire system is worth zero and has no effect and nothing has happened. Things do happen slowly, right? Even all of this shaming at the council, right? Having to have a report, having to listen to NGOs list all the things that you've done. Like that's a form of what you might call horizontalism, right? And there are cases with aid and so on. I mean, but they're quite limited. It gets very tied up with, geopolitics and the relations between particular countries. And, if you're doing a trade deal with that country, you might not want to have a fight with them about human rights. So it's not very strong, but it's not zero. But I think, the comparison with the architecture of hard binding international law that protects the rights of investors, I think that really is the comparison that we should be making, right? It's not like, does the existing system do nothing or something? It does something. But why is it that our world has binding, enforceable systems with essentially global or supranational tribunals that protect the rights of investors, and it's hard and binding, and yet we don't have anything like that on human rights. To me, that's the fundamental question. So yes, it's it's better than nothing, but it's not as good as it should be, I would say.
Okay. Thank you.
Lucy Webster has a question.
Go ahead, Lucy.
There was at one point about, I don't know, 20 or 30 years ago, a Center for Transnational Corporations that existed initially in where the office existed initially in New York, and then I believe it was moved to Geneva. And Gamini Korea from Sri Lanka was one of the leading figures in that. Can you tell me, A, whether that exists, and B, how that fits in with the international human rights organizations?
Yeah, okay, thanks. So when I was saying that these attempts to make international law have been going on since the 70s, I think it was in 1974, the Center for Transnational Corporations was set up, which was round about the time that all these negotiations were set up. It was part of the UN system. It was providing information and helping think about, there's lots of technical issues of, even if you agree you want to regulate transnational corporations, how you actually go about doing that. And really through the 70s and the 80s, these negotiations carried on, as I said before, and the center was a key part of that. And people who worked for the center were very much pushing for regulation of transnational corporations, providing background information. But once we got to the sort of late 80s and the northern countries had got what they want through the bilateral investment treaties, they essentially just stopped negotiating. And then they worked behind the scenes to basically try and stop this whole process and close down the Center for Transnational Corporations. And I think it was in the early 90s, I think 93, that the center was formally closed and disbanded, and these negotiations in that guise officially stopped. A few years later, they popped up. But that was the end of the Center for Transnational Corporations. Incidentally, the people who are pushing now for this treaty are also pushing for a new Center for Transnational Corporations. So, yeah.
And what would be the function of that vis-a-vis the human rights work?
Well, I think once, the first is the sort of issue of, can we get everybody to agree that transnational corporations should be bound by human rights regulation and that we should indeed have a treaty. And once that's done, there's an awful lot of technical questions of how you do it. Because this really would be creating a whole new area of international law. And there are many, like I've sat through discussions with all sorts of lawyers from different countries that were trying to say, well, in the legal system of this country, it's like this, and in that country, it's like this. And would we have direct obligations on the companies, or would the countries be enforcing them? Would we have a national court? Would we have another system? Could be that the parent company of a transnational, so say the company is headquartered in New York, but it operates in Malaysia and Indonesia and many other countries. Could the parent company be held legally liable outside the boundaries of its country, of the US, for activities that its subsidiaries have done in other countries, right? So that's called extraterritoriality. So that would be quite, and then other people that said we need a global court. So there are totally different ways that you can go about trying to regulate transnational corporations and human rights. They would have different implications for all the different actors in the chain. And this would be the kind of thing that the center would be thinking about, having experts doing studies, looking into coming up with proposals that could feed into the discussions. Because at the moment, basically the NGOs are doing the intellectual work and bringing up proposals, and the states are very slow and behind in it. So to have a sort of high-level UN body doing that would actually be great.
You know, when we studied NGOs back in September, I think it was, a lot came up about the global compact and transnational corporations. And of course, I think a lot of the disillusionment in the progressive community anyway about the UN in general, global governance, is because of the assumption that transnational corporations are taking them over. And now it's flowing again into this conversation. And so I know that after we finish coverage of Joe's book, there's a plan within CGS to continue a book club. And I think that studying a book such as When Corporations Rule the World by David Corton or something like that, I think we'd have a very rich and very important discussion if we did something like that. Just one thing I want to mention too, is more of a lay person than many of you. My assumption, I think, for the most part, before I started working with Joe and delving more into global governance topics, was, you know, a holier than thou feeling about the United States when we talked about human rights. You know, everyone else is the problem, and of course we're the pinnacle and the city on the hill as far as human rights. But you were mentioning before the special rapporteurs who go to different countries and write up reports, and these don't ever get in the general US media at all, but somehow through Facebook I've been getting notices about the different reports that come out. One good thing about Facebook. You know, and so for instance, the report on extreme poverty and human rights, this was July 2018, based on visits in November and December of last year. And just reading the introduction, I mean, of course, it's talking about the great gap between rich and poor, but it's really humbling to read. We think of our own country and we know what we know about our country here, but to actually see where we rank in comparison to other countries. Anyway, I think that's, again, it's a matter of, you know, what information is out in the world and what viewpoint we have about our country, but actually we're failing in human rights in so many ways. And anyway, I just wanted to add that to the discussion.
Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree. So maybe I'll let somebody else talk.
Yeah.
Else
any other comments? Kind of our last chance. Bob.
Yeah, well, if no one else has a question, I just have a quick comment that's kind of in agreement with what Dean has been saying. Some years ago, I attended a talk by a woman, an international attorney, and she said whenever she took a case, she was a human rights attorney, and she said whenever she took a case and began to drill down into it, she said she always found that there was a corporation in there somewhere. So I thought that was an interesting way to frame it. So I just wanted to relay that. Thank you.
Great.
So I would like to add a little bit.
Yes, hi, Dad. Go ahead.
Yeah, that when we think about this gap between corporations and governments, the corporations are global and the governments are local, and therefore they cannot regulate properly. We need to think of the corporations also as representative bodies that represent not only the investors but also the consumers. And it's interesting to note that the whole of the consumers that want, I don't know, a shirt or oil, the market unites them all. So, and it gives them the power for the corporation is the representative of the consumers in the world. And so the corporation has the power that is united of all the consumers to bring that product or to bring the profit to the united investors. And this is the important, when we try to understand why the corporations have so much power and why the governments don't, so we need to remember that this is unity that the market is giving to humans as consumers that gives them that power and that influence. And so the only way to really balance that power and check the power of the consumers and the investors would be to have unification of the world's citizens, which is a hard thing to get, but it's just important to remember it.
Great. Well, we are at 12:30 right now, so I think we need to end.